What's up, everyone? Today what I wanted to do is go through this question that was posted on the Learn JavaScript subreddit talking about how to pass a function as an argument to another function in JavaScript. And as you go through this, there are a lot of really reasonable questions that you might encounter if you're just learning JavaScript and if you're just starting out, like understanding why things are being passed around. And so there were a lot of really interesting questions that happened on this thread. So I'm going to post a link to the thread, but I'm also going to just try to explain it myself, how I think about passing functions as arguments to other functions. So the very first thing I'm going to do is open up just an index.html file. And here there's just basic HTML, and I wanted to like write an inline script tag. And here's where we will write our JavaScript. And then maybe we'll make this a little bit smaller. And we can pull this up in a browser in another window. So let's see. Just a second here. All right, so on this page, if we right click and say inspect, that'll show the Chrome developer tools. And we see our console log that happened that just says hi there. And so what I wanted to do is start off really basic and say that like the very first thing we want to do when talking about functions is define a new function. So you can say function foo, and inside of foo we can say console.log I'm in, or like this is foo. Okay, so this, when we write the keyword function and then the name of the function and then open and close parentheses followed by curly braces, this is defining a function. This is declaring a function. This does not actually call the function or execute the function. This is just kind of like preparing some bit of code to be executed later. So if we refresh our page here, we see hi there. We continue to see hi there because we're calling that here at the bottom, but we don't actually see this is foo executed anywhere. So let me make this a little bit bigger. Because we're doing this at the very top level with script, foo is globally available. So if I wanted to, in the terminal here, I could type foo, and that returns to me the function reference. You can actually see what the function looks like, and it even tells you the function body. This will work for code that you've written or that for third-party libraries, but it won't work for native code. So we can't say like document get element by ID or something. If we try to do that, it'll just say that the body of the function is native code, and it won't print that out or tell you what that is. So this is another function that's available just globally in the browser. Now, if we want to execute the function, we can call foo and then add the parentheses at the end of foo. This is what actually invokes foo and calls foo. So now when we refresh the page, we'll see that this is foo is printed to the console followed by hi there. Okay, if we refresh again, you can see this is foo followed by hi there. That's because when we're adding the parentheses, this is when we're actually calling the function or invoking the function. Now, if we wanted to pass arguments to the function, then we could tell the function what the names for those arguments should be when we're working with those variables inside of the function. When we're entering things in between these two parentheses here, this is often called parameters. So here let's just say like x, y, and z are our parameters. And when we call the function, if we're gonna pass some values into the function that the function can then use when it's executing, we pass in things called arguments. So if we passed in 1, 2, 3 as arguments, this is sort of similar to saying like at the top, var x equals 1, var y equals 2, and var z equals 3, and then executing the function. That's kind of how you can think about it as like a mental model, is that when you're passing these arguments, 1, 2, 3, the value that you're passing here for number 1 is now available inside of foo as x. So these are positional. So the position of the argument to the function, it lines up with the name of the parameter to the function. So then like 3 is going into z, 2 is going into y, and 1 is going into x. So now that inside of foo, you can use any of these functions to execute. And so we could say like this is foo, and then x, y, z, and we'll remove our sort of example stuff here. And now if we refresh the browser, you'll see at the bottom, we see this is foo 1, 2, 3. Now, by default, JavaScript is pass pass by value for values or for primitive types like integer, but it is passed by copy of reference when we're passing anything that's not a primitive value. So if it's not a number, a Boolean, or if it's not either of these primitives or any of these primitives, then it will be passed by a copy of reference. So what does that mean? That means that if we were to say, here's like another way that we can think about this foo123 is that if we said like const a or like var a equals 10, b equals 20, and c equals 30, and then we pass in here a, b, c, now the same thing is going to happen. This is exactly the same as our previous example, but instead of using the primitive, like the hard-coded value for 1, 2, and 3, now we're passing in a variable. So the name of this variable at this level of scope is a. Now, the value for a is going to be available inside of x, so that when we run this function, we've sort of like passed 10 or passed a reference to 10 in as the value for x. Now, because these are primitives, we're still passing the primitive value. So if we refresh the page, now we see 10, 20, and 30. Okay, so this is kind of how we pass around arguments. Now, there's no real concept for modifying an integer. Like, we don't change what the meaning of 10 is by making it worth 11 or something. We don't want to change what the value of an integer is. But so we can't really like modify x inside of foo. But instead, what we might do is say that like var a is some object, and that object has a name, and the name is like Alan or something, right? And then if we say like b is 10 and c is 20 still, then now when we're passing in a, we're passing a copy of the reference to this object. So we just created an inline object here, and we gave it the name a. And a is now pointing as a reference to this object. So when we execute foo, a is now going to be passed in as x. So then x will have a reference to this object. And y will have a reference to this b value 10. And c will have a reference to, or z will have a reference to c or 20. So now if we run this function again, now we see that this is foo, and we see the name Alan. This is like the object, right? The object that's being printed out to the console. It has all the properties of a normal object. So this is kind of like how we're executing foo, is by passing in these arguments. Now, when it gets really interesting is when a, or when any of these arguments to the function can themselves be other functions. So if we changed a from being, if we say var a, or instead of creating a variable called a, let's create another function. So we're going to say function a. So this is going to be another function that will say console.log this is a. Okay. So now we have two functions. We have foo and we have a. A is defined, but we're not actually calling a anywhere. We're not invoking a. We're not executing a. We should never see, right now, we're not going to see this is a in the console, right? So if we clear this, now when we call foo, a, we're passing a as a function. So a is an instance of a function, just like we saw with the variables being passed, right? Instead of it being the number 20, instead of it being an object, we're just passing a function now. A function is actually just a special type of object. And because we're not invoking a down here, like we're not actually executing a, we're passing reference to the actual function itself. We're not actually passing the return value or anything. So now we're calling foo and we're passing in a. So now x is going to be a reference to this function that can be executed. Y will be 10 and z will be 20. So if we run this again, now we see this is foo, and now we see our function is being logged to the console, right? We see a. It's being logged, but it's not actually executing, so we don't ever see this is a being like printed to the console. Okay, so the next thing we might want to do is say like, okay, so this is how you pass a function to another function. So we're passing a is a function, we're passing that as a function to foo, but that doesn't really make much sense unless we're executing the function. So inside of foo, if we were to say x and then use parentheses, this will actually call the function a. So this will actually execute function a. So if we refresh the page here, Now we see this is A being printed to the console because this is what's actually executing and running the code for A. If we never actually call X, if we never invoke X or run the code for X, then we're always just passing around references to A. So you can pass around those references just like you might any other object. Okay. Now, sometimes you might see something, let's say like return, this is the return value of A. Okay. If your function returns some value, so in this case, if we were to execute A now, if we just call A in the console, then we would get back, this is the return value of A. So if we clear our console, let's actually clean this up a little bit. We'll hide this. We'll hide hi there just to clean up the console output, and then refresh the page. So now we're still printing out, this is A, and A now has one more line, that's the return value of A. And you'll see that like in the terminal, we have access to A itself. And if we were to call A and use parentheses in the terminal, that will execute A and print out the return value of A, which is returned here. And if we wanted to, then we can say like var bar equals A, and we can call it. And now bar, the value of bar is the return value from A. So when we invoked A, we stored its value using this set, right? The equals operator set the return value from A into this variable bar. So now bar points at the string that was returned from A. So if we were to say foo and we pass in A and we invoke it here, we actually call A and execute A, then we're not actually passing reference to A. Instead, what we're passing is the return value from A. So when we get to this point and we're actually calling foo, what it will do is evaluate each of these arguments as expressions and then pass whatever ultimate whatever the ultimate return value of the expression is. So if you did like false or B, right, it's going to evaluate this expression first, and then whatever the result is of evaluating that expression, that is what's passed as the argument. So in this case, if we're invoking A with parentheses, that is going to like actually execute A. And because the return value of A is this is the return value of A, this string, that's what's actually going to be passed when we call it. So let's see what that looks like. So if we clear the console, refresh the page, now we see this is A, that's being called, right? That's like the very first thing that's called. And then we see this is foo, followed by this is the return value of A, because X, remember that when we invoke A, whatever the resulting expression is here is going to be tied to X, so that inside of foo we have access to that. So now X, the value of X, which we see printed out here, this is the return value of A, because when A executed, it returned this string, and that is what is ultimately now bound to the X parameter, which we can then use inside of foo. So this is how a function is if we're evaluating a function and then passing that as an argument, that is like passing the return value. If we are passing the function name without executing it, then that is just passing reference to the function, and functions can be passed around and used just like any other thing in JavaScript, right? Any other object in JavaScript. So this is not actually executing A in this case. So now if we clear the console and refresh, again, we see this is foo, and then we see the reference to the A function that was not called. Now, why would we actually do this, or what is the value of doing this? There were a bunch of comments in the thread that talked about like why this is important. Here's one example using double and like transforming stuff so you can iterate over an array and then call a callback. So a callback is a very common name for a parameter when a function receives another function as an argument and then eventually calls that callback. So a little bit further down in the thread, we start to see some examples here that use arrow functions. So I wanted to just try to add a little bit more context about that, because it is really common that we use these arrow functions. So if we go back to our code here, and we have our browser window. Okay, so if we go back to our code, another way that we can write either of these functions, so this is like a named function, right? We're using the function keyword, we're specifying the name as A. Another way we could do this is say const A equals, or var a equals, and then parentheses to like say where we would accept parameters, followed by the arrow. The equals with equals greater than is like an arrow. This is called an arrow function. So this is just another way to write the same exact kind of logic or the same exact kind of code, except for this function here is now unnamed. So it's also known as anonymous. And it doesn't take any parameters. And when it's called, it will execute the body of the function just like this. And so if we wanted to, at the bottom here, we could just say like, a with our parentheses, and that would execute a. Okay, so we see this is a, and it prints out. Alternatively, if we wanted to pass some arguments, g, h, I, we could do that here. We could say this is a, g, h, I. And now when we execute a, we can pass in, like whatever, 100, 200, 300. And when a is called, it will print out this is a, 100, 200, 300. We clear this and refresh. Now we see this is a, 100, 200, 300. That's because our function a, we are storing reference to the anonymous function in a variable called a, or a variable named a, and now we can execute it with the parentheses like so. So one of the really common ways that you will see functions being passed as arguments to other functions is with this arrow function style. So we give it the open parens, followed by an arrow, followed by sometimes parentheses, or sometimes curly braces, sometimes not. Now the curly braces matter when your function is a multi-line function. If it's a single liner, then you don't actually need to pass those. But if we were to do something here where we just say like console.log I am here, now we're executing foo, right? We're executing foo, which is this function, and that is taking in x, y, and z. This time, x is referring to this anonymous function that we just defined the arrow function style. So we're just passing it in line here. And now if we refresh the page, now x is pointing at the function I am here. Now a isn't actually used in this example anymore. We're not passing a around. We don't see this as a. A is not executed. We're passing in this anonymous function. The other way, again, that you might see it here is like if we were to cut that function and paste it and then say like var d equals this function, and then we pass that as the first argument, then we would see kind of like the same output, right? In this case, we're just like passing a variable that holds reference to the object instead of passing the object or passing the function itself. Okay. So now what we might want to do is show some examples of where this is really commonly used. So the browser exposes a function called setTimeout, which itself can take a function as the first argument and then a time as the second argument. So let's figure out what our arguments might be. So if we pass foo as our first argument, which is the function we want called, and then like 3000 as the second argument, that's like the number of milliseconds until this should be executed. SetTimeout again is available in the browser. And just for fun, if we console.log scheduling foo to be called in 3 seconds. And then if we say, right after we call setTimeout, we say scheduled foo. Now you'll see what happens is we will print to the console this first string, scheduling foo to be called in 3 seconds, and then immediately this is going to run super quickly, and then we're going to print this out super quickly. So these two print statements are going to happen immediately when the page loads, and then this is foo will not print to the console until after 3 seconds pass. Okay, so in this case, we're passing in reference to foo. We are not passing in the return value of foo. We're passing in reference to foo. And now when we refresh the page, we see those two print statements, and boom, this is foo. Now it's getting undefined, undefined, undefined because we're not passing any arguments here. We're not able to specify any arguments. And you might imagine that inside of the function setTimeout, it takes in a function argument and it takes in some time, right? And then it says something like after time passes, then call fn, and then it calls function like this, right? So it's going to execute the function with the parentheses inside of the setTimeout function. We don't define setTimeout. setTimeout is available on the browser. It is part of like the JavaScript API to schedule and do things a little bit later. And this is how it works. And this is a really common example of where we would pass in an argument. Now, it's a little bit more common to call set timeout and pass in a function directly. So you might say function, and then in here you would say like do this later. So we're going to console.log. I'm run 3 seconds later, right? So in this case, we're just passing a reference to a function directly in line to set timeout instead of passing foo directly. So if we refresh the page now, we see these two scheduling things, and then 3 seconds later, it says I'm run 3 seconds later. Now, if you wanted to execute foo and you wanted to pass some arguments to foo, you could do that inside of set timeout by saying foo A, B, C, right? So now foo is going to run 3 seconds later, but because we're passing it the execution of foo, so now we're actually calling foo, but we're passing that inside of this other function that we're passing to set timeout. So set timeout, when 3 seconds passes, set timeout will execute this whole anonymous function. And when the whole anonymous function is running, it encounters this foo where it's being executed. So that will look up foo. It's going to say, was foo defined inside of this function, or was it passed in? No. Okay, then look in the enclosing scope. So look up one scope higher, and then it will find foo. So if we execute this, we should see foo printed out 3 seconds later. So now we see this is foo. We're passing A, which again is reference to another function, and we're passing B and C, which both point at the numbers 10 and 20 respectively, which are going to bind to Y and Z respectively. Okay, one other example that I want to show real quick that's really common is with API calls. With fetch or Axios or some other, so like in the browser, if you want to make a request to a server manually with JavaScript, you can use this function called fetch. And fetch takes in, if you're just making a GET request to retrieve some data, then you can pass in as the first argument a URL. And in this case, I think we can use the Star Wars API. So let's use swappy.dev. And okay, so this is the base for the URL. And then /people/1 should give us back Luke Skywalker. So if we pass in the URL to fetch, right? So fetch is a function that's available on the browser, and it takes in a URL. And after it finishes, it returns a promise, or like when fetch finishes executing, it returns a promise, and that promise is called exposes a set of methods. One of those methods is called then. Now, when we call then, we can pass it a function that will run once the browser is done fetching the data. So we can pass in a function here, right? And we can say like console.log done fetching data. Okay, so now if we refresh the page, right? A request was sent to the Star Wars API to retrieve something. And then when it finished its request, then the browser executed this function, which we passed in. So another way to look at this is if we console.log like fetching some data, and then we're going to say, after we call fetch here, we're going to say like finished starting the data fetch. At this point though, right, like we didn't actually get the data we didn't finish getting all the data back, right? Because this is going to take a little bit, and then this function will run asynchronously later at some later point that's going to run. So we'll see these two print statements, fetching some data, finished starting the data fetch, and then we'll see done fetching data. Okay, so we see fetching some data, finished starting the data fetch, and then done fetching the data. Okay, so that's kind of like the order of those operations. Now, here we just passed in an anonymous function. If we wanted to, we could have passed a name function here. We can just pass in foo if we wanted, right? Because foo itself, again, is reference to a function. So if we run this, now we're going to see that we see this is foo. Now, because foo takes in the arguments x, y, and z, when the function that's passed to then is executed, it actually does pass in some arguments. So inside of then, right, like who whoever implemented the browser implemented fetch, and they also implemented then. And inside of then, what they're doing is like, once we get the data back from the API, we're going to call this function foo. And when we call the function foo, we're going to pass it some arguments. And one of those arguments is the response. So it turns out like we see this is foo, right? That's from this statement, this is foo. Then we see a response object. This whole response object is what came back from our fetch call. Or I'm sorry, this is the object that was passed as the first argument to our then call. And then we see undefined, undefined. So when then is executed for fetch, there are no second or third arguments in this case, in this successful case. Okay, so this response object doesn't actually give you the data. Instead, you have to call this JSON method on the response object, which again returns a promise. So if we use our fancy arrow function here, we can say like R is going to be returning r.json. Okay, and that JSON object, when this promise resolves, that will return yet again another promise that we can chain on another .then, and we can add another function here. We can say like console.log r, or let's rename r to data to make it a little bit more explicit. Okay, now if we clear this out and refresh the page, we see we finished fetching, and then the data that we see printed to the console is Luke Skywalker, it's blonde, has skin color, and like all the data that came back from the Star Wars API. But in this case, right, like we called the fetch method, and later we passed in two functions. The first one converted the response into JSON, and the second one converted that JSON, or just like printed out that JSON to the console. Now, when we're using these arrow functions, it turns out that you can, or if your function only accepts one argument, you can remove those parentheses. So let's clear this out and then refresh the page, and it works exactly the same. Furthermore, if your function is a one-liner, then you don't actually even need the curly braces or anything else, or the return statement, because the last expression evaluated in a single line arrow function is what is going to be returned. So this is like setting a return value implicitly. So this should also work exactly the same. So we refresh the page, and we see the same thing printed to the console. We can even like clean this up further and just say like that's what the whole function looks like. Yeah. So this is yet another example of how you might pass functions as arguments, and when it can be handy when using API calls. So we talked about set timeout. You can also use set interval to do something like repeatedly every X milliseconds. Fetch is a really common API. You might also see like when you're working with an array. So let's say for like const students is equal to like Jim, Sally, or something, right? Then you might have students.forEach, and the forEach method is a convenience method on array. And this method happens to take a function, and that function is called for each element in the array. So you can pass in like function x or like student. So we're passing in this function that's going to be called every single time for each of the students in the list. And there were some examples in the thread about, in the Reddit thread about how this might work. So you might say like console.log student. Okay, so if we comment all this out and just execute this, then you'll see Jim and Sally. So this can be helpful if you want to like loop over some list of things and do something for each of them. There's also like map and reduce and filter and find and index of, and a whole bunch of helpful methods that are available on array, many of which accept a function as an argument and then will do something as the result of the function execution. So this content is far from perfect, but I really like making videos. I like sharing information. I'm obsessed with programming and obsessed with APIs. And if I can encourage you to do the same or be into the same stuff, then I've done what I've set out to do. If you've made it this far in the video, it would really mean a lot to me if you gave it a like. It helps the YouTube algorithm, and if we can get this in front of folks who it would be helpful for, then that would make me really, really happy. Thanks so much for everything. I really appreciate you watching. I want you to subscribe and hit that notification so that you can be alerted when new content is available. Also, I would welcome you to follow me on Twitter, and my DMs are open. I would be happy to chat about any questions you have. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.